Please sit down. And just relax for a few seconds, and then the first part of the test is done with the first 7 methodologies. And then we have enough pieces of the jigsaw to really see the main functions of the body, and what's called homeostasis. That's kind of how things are correlated with each other. Like if something is off, you have other functions to compensate for that or to try to fix that. So we need to see also that they are. Like sometimes a symptom can come from compensation. So then if you take a drug to reduce that symptom, you're just reducing the compensation that was actually very much needed due to this problem. So it's also important to find out what is causing what is just compensating, what is trying to fix something, and then to work on the core problems and not reduce important compensations. Okay, so on the first page here we have some highlights from the different testing methodologies, and then we're going to go deeper into each of them before we then start looking at conclusions where things are calculated towards one another. Some of the main functions in your body are actually really good. An example of that is how much blood you're pumping throughout your body per minute per meter height. So it's really the circulation and how much blood and oxygen you're pumping through the body. The ideal is 3.1 liter, and that is what you have.
Perfect.
So that's really good. We see the stiffness of your arteries is also in the middle norm. So that's great. The reflection index here is measuring how the circulation goes to the head. That should be 30%, and it is 30%.
Okay.
This is how long time it takes for the blood to go through the smallest peripheral arteries in the body, and this is also good. So basically your arteries are good and your flow of blood is good. However, there is a tiny little imbalance, but it's compensated for with perfection. The tiny little imbalance is that your SVR, which is systemic vascular resistance, is slightly elevated. That just means that since you don't have high stiffness in the arteries, because then it could have been atherosclerosis, but it's not, because that would have given more stiffness. So it just means that there's a little bit vasoconstriction. That's when the arteries kind of narrow down just a little bit because of inflammation or some sort of reaction that's happening in your body. But we see despite that, you still have a perfect flexible artery, and everything is really good here. This is not even related to your cardiovascular system, it's related to something else in your body that is creating some inflammation.
Okay.
And you see also how it's compensated for with perfection. So your blood pressure is slightly elevated.
Okay.
But that's what it needs to be, because the blood pressure always needs to be what gives you the perfect cardiac index, and it is. So for some people, this might be too low even. If the systemic vascular resistance was very high, then you would need to push harder to get the blood through the arteries when there's less passage.
Right.
So for some this will be too low, for some it will be too high, but for you it's perfect.
Okay. Makes sense.
But once we fix whatever is creating those inflammatory responses, then this will normalize and this will normalize and this will stay fine, since it's already regulated so well.
Okay.
The delivery of oxygen is also great. So the amount of oxygen in your arterial blood, first of all the SpO2, which is oxygen percentage of the hemoglobin, is 97%, that's great. And then also we see that there's enough hemoglobin and you are delivering enough oxygen. However, your uptake of oxygen is reduced. So through your vascular system you're delivering the oxygen, but your cells are not working 100%. So for that reason you're not consuming enough oxygen, even though the supply is good enough. And
So
we
I'm
see
not absorbing the oxygen, or what do you mean by consuming?
it means that on the cellular level there are activities that are not optimal. I have not yet found any problems. We're going to go through that and see what we find, but it's not optimal.
Okay.
And when the cells are not functioning optimal, they usually don't consume as much oxygen, and that's what we're seeing here. So the supply is good, but the consumption is low.
Consumption is okay. Gotcha.
Basically what is measured is oxygen in arterial blood and then in venous blood, which is what's going back. and it's when there's here too much oxygen in the venous blood, which means you didn't consume quite enough.
Okay.
Then we see that the contractions of your heart is with 98.78 grams per beat. That's the high norm, and that's how you got that compensation to compensate for the vasoconstriction. But when it's compensating and still within the norm, then that's really perfect.
Okay.
So really what I'm trying to say is that your cardiovascular functions are fine and even good enough to compensate when that is needed.
Okay.
Your pulse is fine, 75. The capacity for regulation in your autonomic nervous system is good, so when you need to regulate to a specific situation, let's say someone is trying to attack you or a lion is jumping you, then your body will change and adapt to that situation so that you can either fight it or run, and you get more resources to what you need in that situation, because those regulations in your system is quite dynamic and good. So that's very good. However, there is a slightly elevated regulation of the parasympathetic and also slightly elevated of the sympathetic system. So these regulations are dynamic, but they're upregulated a little bit. So your body is working, it's kind of upregulating certain processes. The parasympathetic is upregulating digestive processes. So there's something going on with your digestion. And you didn't eat for 2 hours, right?
Yeah, I haven't eaten since probably 11 or so.
So that means something is still going on in your digestive system, but it shouldn't, not that long after eating. But it still is. So we need to find out what is still going on in your digestive system, and I'm pretty certain we will find out.
Okay.
And then we see also your sympathetic system was a little bit upregulated. Sometimes one can be suppressed by the others, but here everything is a little bit upregulated. But that looks like a tiny stress response. It's not a big stress response, but I think it's really from the situation that you're a little bit stressed out with what we might find there or with the test itself.
Right.
Because it's not really showing that there's a problem with the sympathetic, it's just a slight, like short-term increase due to the situation. That's what it looks like. But the parasympathetic regulation, regulating your digestive system, looks like a more chronic situation. Okay. Your body composition, the fat percentage is 35.5. That is too high, and you would benefit quite a lot actually from reducing that. When this goes into the orange region, it means that you need other compensations for that. So your body needs to kind of regulate and adapt and adjust other things in a different way to compensate for that. And that could also be part of the reason why you're pushing harder and why there's a little bit vasoconstriction. Also, it could be that it's related also to 5%.
Okay.
And we see the distribution of water is also not ideal. Your sasa, it's slightly swollen, which indicates that there is a little bit inflammation somewhere. So we will try to find out where there's inflammation and then why there's inflammation.
Okay.
Based on this body fat mass of 35.5%, then you heard about the 80-20 rule, right? Typically here this is 80% diet and 20% exercise. But the best is to do both.
Right.
So if you could up your exercise level a little bit and also improve your diet, then that would be great. And improving the diet is the 80% here.
Yeah, I know that. For sure.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you know it. Then it's just a matter of deciding to do something about it.
Right.
So here we're looking at the cellular activity. And we can see that in your lower abdomen, your exchange of sodium potassium ions is quite low. That's what we're measuring here, standard deviation control of the plus ion exchange over the cell membrane. So that means from here down, there's low cell activity. And that means that there is something chronic, because if it's acute, they're working more to fix it.
Okay.
But when it's chronic, then they're suffering from that chronic situation, but no longer really trying to fix it. So that's the situation here. And you see the level, it should be 8.33 to 14.71 microsievert, and this is 2.4.
Right.
So it is actually just 1/4 of the low norm and 1/5 of the ideal, which means like 20% of the ideal.
Right.
And that's the activity level in your abdomen.
Okay.
So in your abdomen you have intestines, you have bladder, prostate, things like that. So we will find out where and what. But in this area, you're really running on like 20% of the capacity on your cellular function.
Okay.
Then we see that in your a little bit higher up you have a high SSE minus but a normal SSE plus. So this is the cell activity. So higher up the activity of the cells is normal. But when this is high, it means that there's inflammation. So a little bit higher up there's inflammation, and here it's suffering from what's going on with the chronic dysregulation.
So there's the low. Okay, so this is the lower, and then this was a little bit higher up, and then this is even higher up.
And this is
this one.
This one is the. This is not the cellular activity. That's what we're looking at the SSE plus. But this is SSE minus, so we're measuring the ratio of Cl minus and H plus. So what that means is when this is high, there's inflammation, because then those will go up.
Okay.
So that's really the interpretation.
Okay.
So there's inflammation somewhere in the beginning of your digestive system, and further down in your digestive system, or possibly it has to do with the urogenital system, there is a chronic underactivity, hypofunction of the cells, about 20% of the normal level.
Okay.
So we need to find out what that is about, and then we should do something about it. Okay, I'm just looking at all the segments now to see what is standing out. So Mandy, what do you make out of this so far?
What do you want me to say?
Have you been paying attention?
Slightly, yes.
So low activity in this digestive, right? 20% capacity? Or 26%?
In the lower abdomen, which is either intestines or urogenital system. So we will need to find out that. And there's some inflammatory response, but normal cellular function a little bit higher up in the digestive system.
I knew it was going to be digestion.
Could any of that be? Could any of that like have an effect on like your everyday, day-to-day energy levels, or?
Of course.
Fatigue.
The most common cause of fatigue, actually.
Fatigue.
Okay. So this is like an overall evaluation of the cardiovascular system. So here you have all the individual figures is calculated into categories, and then we can see which category is off. And a category can be off if there's one factor that's horrible and other factors are not compensating well enough, or it could be that there are two small factors that don't look that bad, but they're both pulling in the same direction, so the outcome is not really that great. If one goes down, the other should go up maybe, and they're both down.
Okay.
So what we see is that the interpretations of two categories here is red, which means that's the most critical.
Okay.
One is that regulation of the autonomic nervous system, which we talked about to be an hyper-regulation of some digestive processes.
Right.
So this is related to the digestive system.
Okay.
And then there's a lifestyle class here, and what was standing out there is really the fat percentage.
Right.
A little bit pulled down also here by not exercising enough, but it's primarily the fat percentage that makes this go like that.
Right.
Then you have other factors. You see, this is how the heart is working. You see, it's perfect. Green is the best it can be. And the delivery of oxygen is really, really good.
Okay.
And the stiffness of the arteries is really good. So this is perfect. This is better than normal, and the gray is normal. So the overall here is that this is normal.
Okay.
And this is also kind of important to look at the homeostasis of this, because if, like when these are green here, then even with that fat mass and even with that problematic regulation due to the digestive problems, then it doesn't affect your heart, because your heart and your vascular system is so good that it's not really affected despite those problems at this stage. But if you had just a tiny problem with that, it would have been aggravated to the extreme, and you would suffer a lot of problems. Just from a small problem, this would then be a big problem because of those aggravating factors here.
I see.
to see how things need to kind of be connected and see things in correlation. Okay, so now we're going to look at some statistical correlations. So there's 7 hospitals that participated in making a reference database for some really important factors for health.
Okay.
And they would then test a total of 30,000 people is in a reference database, and they would test people with a certain problem and then test them several times, different times of the day on this device, and they would look for what do they have in common on every test. Everyone with that problem, on every test they do, what do they have in common that nobody else has in common?
Right.
And if you have a full match to any of those, it will be a red pole here. But as long as it is colored, it means that there is a match that you can find with a conventional medical assessment.
Okay.
And if it's gray, it means that if it goes up, there's an imbalance in the direction of that problem, but it's not like enough to give a diagnosis or anything like that.
Okay.
So the first one, which is the most important, is as low as it can be, and that's really good, because that is when there's atheroma. Do you know what an atheroma is?
No, what's atheroma?
So your arteries, you know where the blood
flows through it,
are supposed to be really smooth and nice on the inside, and
Okay.
then everything flows through really easily.
Okay.
But if they get a little bit rough on the inside due to inflammation or calcification, then fats will start to stick.
Right.
Or if you have a horrible diet, it might stick even without those problems. And that's when there's a little buildup of fat. And then if that continues to such a point that in some terms it builds up so that it's a really low passage through a certain curve, then that is called atheroma. And the problem with that is that you can have blood clotting there and can create thrombosis. So you do not have any trace of atheroma, which is good. There's no risk of thrombosis or blockage or anything like that.
Right.
But you see the second one here is measuring how much fat is sticking to the arteries.
Okay.
It says here LDL cholesterol, but that's not what it's measuring,
Okay.
because all these are 510K registered with FDA, which means you have to register it within an existing category, and then it's registered with what the accuracy of the test is within the category. And this device is actually measuring how much fat is inside the arteries, but FDA doesn't have a category for that, so that's why it says cholesterol.
Okay.
So you see there are some fat sticking to the arteries, but it's not really a problem. That's why it's not colored here.
Okay.
But there's some fat sticking to the arteries. So the diet here and
That's
the
mainly
exercise
diet and
and
exercise.
reducing your whole body fat percentage will also reduce it in the arteries, and that will be good prevention. You don't have a problem with it now, so that's not curing anything. That's more prevention for preventing problems too here. Like, you're still very young, so it's not common for this to create much problems, but these are typically the things that do create big problems for people when they get older.
Right. Okay.
You can take the finger thing off.
Oh, I can take this off. You can put this down if your hand's getting tired.
What?
If your hand's getting tired, you can just leave it here
So-
or whatever.
So then there's no hypertrophy. What that means is that your heart is not enlarged from having to work too hard for too long.
Okay.
But there is some inflammatory process.
Yes.
So clearly there's some inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then we go to the blood sugar regulation program. What we see here is that you have a yellow marker for metabolic syndrome.
Okay.
Do you know what metabolic syndrome is?
Nope, I guess something to do with how your metabolism is. I don't know.
Well, in a sense, to explain it, in simple terms, it's when you eat carbohydrates, they're supposed to convert to energy.
Right.
When you have metabolic syndrome, they are stored as fat instead of being converted to energy. So you don't get energy from carbohydrates, you just create fat from it.
Okay.
And already now, from seeing this, I can see that high fat percentage that you have is not from eating fats or anything like that. It is because you are creating fat when you eat carbohydrates, and it's stored.
Okay. And can you change that does exercise change your
You can
metabolic
change
rate
that by having a low carb diet combined with exercise.
Okay.
In theory, you can change it only by that,
Okay.
but you can also make it shift faster by treating it. So we have
Okay.
treatments here that can make your body change that faster, but you will anyway have to improve your diet.
Okay.
It's just that instead of this, by itself slowly over time shift, then we can shift much more quickly.
Okay.
Excuse me, sauna is ready for the new